In 1995, Quentin Tarantino was king. Reservoir Dogs had created a storm in 1991, and he was now releasing his sophomore effort, Pulp Fiction, proving that Dogs was no accident. A slew of wannabes followed. Everybody was trying to capture their own piece of LA cool. Gangsters were hip, heroin was chic, and quips were all but expected. On the other side of the country, in New York City, different things were happening. Edgier things, darker things, far more thought-provoking things than $5 milkshakes and round-the-table discussions of Madonna lyrics. Abel Ferrara, an indie maverick from the 70s, was onto something grand. With nothing short of gut-wrenching realism, Ferrara was capturing the real zeitgeist of the time, one that shed light on what it was like to live in the USA in the mid-90s. His twisted male melodramas rewrote the code of the traditional cop and gangster films on more than one occasion. King of New York in 1990, The Bad Lieutenant in 1992, then The Funeral in 1996. All made with stunning honesty and brutality. Nihilistic and amoral, these films told the tales of individuals who were embarking on a journey towards the corruption of the body and the soul. His anti-heroes were crime kingpins, drug pushers, and corrupt police, the exact people who were populating the headline news that night. Ferrara was, and remains to this day, an agent provocateur, giving us films that are corrupt and contemptible, but they're also oozing weight and meaning. Then, in 1995, he gave us The Addiction, written by longtime friend and collaborator Nicholas St. John, who seemingly only produces scripts for Ferrara and Ferrara alone. This modern, monochromatic masterpiece was an unconventional vampire tale set in the dark pits of New York City, starring Lily Taylor and Christopher Walken. The Addiction was the anti-Pulp Fiction, an independent film that was challenging, provocative, and intelligent in all the ways that Tarantino was not. Arriving like a gut punch, The Addiction tells a story of philosophy postgraduate student Kathleen Conklin, Lily Taylor, who really has never managed to match her performance here, who while walking home alone one night is dragged into an alley and attacked by a beautiful, elegant stranger, played by Annabella Sciorra. She survives the attack only to evolve a distaste to sunlight and a hunger that simply cannot be satisfied by anything other than human blood. Perhaps the thinking man's horror film, it asks the viewer along for a ride as Kathleen, the shy, timid intellectual, shifts her moral compass as the vampiric addiction takes hold. Where once she was horrified and conflicted by the atrocities of the US soldiers in Vietnam, the subject of her doctorate thesis at university, she gradually begins to embrace the freedoms of her new condition. Killing becomes second nature to her. In most cases, her victims are nameless strangers that she hunts in the street, and with every bite she condemns them to an eternal life of killing in order to satisfy the overwhelming bloodlust that consumes them. She even drags ethics into the mix. She asks her subjects, makes them tell her to leave them alone, removing the onus of her actions from herself and, in turn, the guilt for the perpetration of her horrendous deeds. In fact, what Ferrara and St. John have so successfully achieved is to create a storm in a teacup that is Kathleen. Where once she failed to understand throughout her philosophy studies the motivations and actions of those society deemed monstrous, she is now trying to rationalize through her own behavior with her academic knowledge. Complex stuff indeed. It really is no wonder that Empire magazine called The Addiction perhaps the most seriously intended horror film of the 90s. But The Addiction is more than just a group of intellectual philosophy students spouting rhetoric and grappling with the complexities of life and death. On one hand, that's exactly what it is. On another, the whole film is an explicit, on-the-nose metaphor for drug addiction. But then there's also a layer that has a really wicked stab at academia. Throughout most of the film, Kathleen and her best friend, Jean, played by Edie Falco, a couple of years before she became Mrs. Soprano, they talk to each other in little more than pretentious, over-analyzed academic theories. As the addiction takes a firmer hold on Kathleen, even her own personal rationalization for her actions comes in philosophical rhetoric. By the time the film's shocking, blood-soaked climax concludes, Kathleen has graduated university and received her PhD, and at a party that she organizes, she literally eats the entire academic faculty. So the addiction is a darkly comic satire on intellectualism then. All this talk of intellectualism and philosophy rhetoric, however, doesn't really mention anything of the actual production of the addiction. Clocking in at a modest 80 minutes, there is a wealth of ideas presented, all surprisingly given adequate screen time to evolve and to breathe and to conclude without ever feeling rushed or glazed over. Mention must be made of the superb cameo by Ferrara favourite Christopher Walken as the vampire Piena, who has controlled his addiction and leads an almost human life. He all but kidnaps Kathleen and tries to teach her how to live a human life, but the hunger gets the better of her and she recedes back into the darkness of the New York streets once again. Walken's brief 10-minute on-screen presence will stay with the viewer long after the final credits have rolled, for it seems that St. John has written the part specifically for Walken, so convincing is his portrayal of this timeless creature. And all of this is set against a backdrop of New York as only could be photographed by Ferrara's longtime collaborator Ken Kelch, who also shot Driller Killer and The Bad Lieutenant for him. Kelch makes mincemeat out of the film's 20-day shooting schedule. While the black and white photography could be read as another nod to the academic flavourings of film student productions, it also bathes the film in a starkness that colour stock simply couldn't capture. The grimy New York setting loses nothing of its potency. If anything, the black and white makes the city a much more threatening presence. The whites are whiter and the black shadows are a place that we, the viewer, just don't want to tread. This is not a film that will suit the casual viewer. In fact, it's fair to say it would probably polarize the general public. You will love it or you will hate it, and there will be no middle ground. The Addiction was, for the longest time, far from Ferrara's most accessible work, but thanks to mobs like Arrow Films and Criterion, the film is getting a new lease of life. For those who seek it out, you will be richly rewarded.